The knife was already at her throat when Lila Hart realized she had walked into the wrong room. She had only meant to deliver a tray of warm bread to the East Hall before the wedding feast began. Instead, she found 2 guards pressed against the wall, and a third man standing over them with a blade pulled from his own belt, his eyes wild with something that looked like fear more than anger. Lila froze in the doorway, the tray shaking in her hands. The man turned toward her, and for one long breath, nobody moved. Then the doors at the far end of the hall burst open, and Alpha King Ashton Cole stepped through them like a storm given a human shape. He crossed the room before Lila could blink. His hand closed around the attacker's wrist, and the blade dropped to the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the hall louder than it should have. The guards scrambled back to their feet, apologizing, explaining, but Ashton was not listening to them. He was looking at Lila. It was only a second, maybe less. But in that second, something passed between them that neither one could name. Lila felt her chest tighten, as if the air had been pulled out of the room. Ashton's jaw went tight, and his gold-brown eyes, the eyes of a king who commanded 12 packs and half the Northern Territory, held hers like he was trying to remember something he had lost a long time ago. Then Seraphina Vale walked in, dressed in ivory silk, her dark hair pinned with silver combs, and the moment shattered like glass. "Ashton," she said, her voice smooth and light, though her gaze cut straight to Lila and the fallen tray of bread. "The guests are asking for you. It would not do for the groom to be missing on his own wedding day." Ashton straightened. He released the attacker to the guards, who dragged the man away without another word, and he did not look back at Lila again. He offered his arm to Seraphina, and together they walked out into the courtyard, where hundreds of guests waited under strings of golden lights, where musicians were already tuning their instruments, where a future queen was about to become real. Lila stood alone in the empty hall, the bread scattered across the floor, her heart still pounding for no reason she could explain. She told herself it was only fear from the knife. She told herself the ache spreading through her chest was nothing more than the shock of nearly being harmed. But some small, stubborn part of her did not believe that explanation, and it would not let her rest for the remainder of the day. By the time she gathered the bread back onto the tray and hurried toward the kitchens, the wedding march had already begun. She could hear it faintly through the walls, the old wedding song that every child in the Coalpack lands had grown up hearing, a song about promises that were meant to last forever. The kitchen was full of noise and steam when she arrived. Eleanor, the head housekeeper, spotted her immediately and set both hands on her hips. "Where have you been? The guests will want fresh bread within the hour, and you have been gone twice as long as it should take to walk to the East Hall and back." "There was trouble," Lila said quietly. "A man with a knife. The guards are handling it now." Eleanor's sharp expression softened only slightly. She had known Lila since she was a child of 7, brought to the Cole household after her parents were killed in a border conflict that no one in the kitchens liked to speak about. Eleanor had raised her more than any blood relative ever had, teaching her to cook, to sew, to keep her head down and her voice quiet, because an Omega girl with no pack standing had to survive on carefulness rather than boldness. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor asked, quieter now. "No," Lila said, "only frightened." But it was not fear sitting heavy in her chest as she returned to her work, kneading dough with hands that trembled slightly more than they should have. It was the memory of gold-brown eyes staring at her, as though she were the only person left standing in a burning building. She pushed the thought away and told herself it meant nothing. A king did not look twice at a servant girl, not truly, not in any way that mattered, and even if some strange flicker of feeling had passed between them, it changed nothing about her place in the world. Today, Ashton Cole was marrying Seraphina Vale, daughter of the powerful Vale Pack from the Western Hills, and Lila Hart would spend the rest of the celebration exactly where she always spent celebrations, in the kitchen, unseen, unremarkable, safe. Outside, the ceremony proceeded exactly as it had been planned for months. Elders from both packs stood in solemn rows. Nathaniel Cole, Ashton's father, had died 2 winters ago, but his old friend and advisor, a stern, gray-haired man named Marcus, stood in his place to speak the binding words. Seraphina's father, Edwin Vale, watched with a proud, satisfied expression, the look of a man who had finally secured everything he had worked toward for a decade. Seraphina herself was beautiful in the way that commanded attention, sharp cheekbones, a straight spine, dark eyes that missed nothing happening around her. She had trained her whole life to become someone's queen, and she intended to be a good one. She recited her vows clearly, without a single tremor in her voice, and when Ashton spoke his own vows in return, his voice was steady too. But steady was not the same as certain. Something in his chest felt hollow as the words left his mouth, a strange emptiness that made no sense given the importance of the day. He told himself it was simply the weight of duty. Kings did not marry for feeling. They married for peace between packs, for strength against enemies, for the safety of every family living under their protection. Love, if it came at all, was something that grew slowly afterward, like a garden planted late in the season. He believed that. He had always believed that. And yet, as the ceremony ended and the crowd erupted into applause, as Serafina turned to him with a small, satisfied smile, Ashton's mind kept drifting back to a pair of frightened brown eyes in an empty hall, and a strange, aching familiarity he could not place no matter how hard he tried. The feast that followed lasted well into the evening. Long tables filled the courtyard, heavy with roasted meat, fresh bread, and wine brought down from the northern vineyards. Musicians played, and pack members from both territories mingled and laughed, celebrating an alliance that would keep two powerful families safe from the smaller, hungrier packs pushing at their borders. Lila worked through it all in the kitchen and the serving halls, carrying trays back and forth, refilling cups, clearing empty plates. She was good at her work, quick and quiet, the kind of servant nobody noticed unless something went wrong. Tonight nothing went wrong, and so she remained invisible, exactly as she always was at gatherings like this. Except once. Near midnight, as the feast was winding down and the guests grew louder with wine, Lila carried a tray of wine cups toward the high table where Ashton sat beside his new wife. She kept her eyes low, as she had been trained to do, offering the tray without a single word. Ashton reached for a cup. His fingers brushed against hers. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but the jolt that shot through his arm felt like lightning striking dry ground. He inhaled sharply. His wolf, usually calm and controlled beneath the surface of his human mind, surged forward with a force he had not felt in years, howling a single word inside his skull that made no sense at all. Mate. Ashton's hand closed around the cup, and he forced himself to remain still, to breathe evenly, to look nowhere but forward. Beside him, Serafina was laughing at something her father had said, unaware of anything happening only inches away from her. Lila, for her part, felt the same electric jolt travel up her own arm, and her breath caught in her throat before she could stop it. She pulled the tray back quickly, too quickly, and one of the empty cups clattered against another. A few nearby guests glanced over, and Lila lowered her head even further, murmuring an apology before hurrying away from the table as fast as dignity allowed. She did not look back. She did not dare to. But Ashton watched her go, watched the way her dark hair swung against her shoulders as she disappeared through the servants' door, and something inside him ached with a longing so sudden and so strong that it frightened him more than the knife in the East Hall ever could have. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the wine, a strange coincidence, the exhaustion of a long and important day catching up with his senses. Mates were rare and unmistakable, and if he had one waiting somewhere in the world, surely he would have known it long before his own wedding night to another woman. Surely he would have remembered. He did not know, not yet, that the reason he did not remember was not an accident of fate. He did not know that somewhere buried deep beneath years of careful forgetting, a memory waited to be found again. A memory of a night long before this one, when a much younger Ashton Cole had looked into the very same brown eyes, and known, without any doubt at all, that he had found the one person meant only for him. That night was gone from his mind now, stolen away by a shaman's careful hands and a dying father's desperate wish to save his kingdom. But memories, even hidden ones, do not disappear completely. They wait, quiet and patient, for the right spark to bring them back to life. And in the kitchen that night, alone at last with her hands still trembling faintly from a single touch she could not explain, Lila Hart pressed her fingers against her own chest and wondered, for the very first time in her life, why an ordinary servant girl would feel her heart break at the sight of a king marrying someone else. She had no name for the feeling. She only knew that something inside her recognized him, even though she was certain, absolutely certain, that they had never met before in her life. She was wrong. The scream came from the training yard before the sun had fully risen. Lila dropped the basket of laundry she was carrying and ran toward the sound without thinking, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone path. A young girl named Grace, no older than 8, the daughter of one of the palace guards, had wandered too close to the wolf pens during the morning exercises, and one of the newer, less disciplined wolves had broken free of its handler's control. The animal circled the terrified child, growling low in its throat, while grown warriors shouted and scrambled for weapons they were too far away to use in time. Lila did not think about danger. She only thought about the child. She reached Grace just as the wolf lunged, and threw herself between them, wrapping her arms around the girl and turning her own back to the animal's teeth. Pain exploded across her shoulder, sharp and burning, and she heard herself cry out even as she refused to let go of the child in her arms. Then, suddenly, the weight and fury of the attacking wolf were gone. Ashton had shifted mid-run, faster than anyone in the yard had ever seen him move before, crossing the distance in 3 enormous bounds and slamming into the smaller wolf with the full force of his much larger body. The fight ended almost as quickly as it began. The rogue wolf yelped and scrambled back, submitting instantly to the raw authority radiating from its king, and the handlers rushed forward at last to drag the animal away and secure it properly. Ashton shifted back to human form, breathing hard, and turned to find Lila on her knees in the dirt, blood soaking through the shoulder of her dress, her arms still locked protectively around a sobbing but unharmed Grace. Something inside him broke open at the sight. He was at her side before he realized he had moved, kneeling in the dust of the training yard without any concern for his fine morning clothes, his hands hovering over her injured shoulder as though afraid to touch her and cause more pain. "Someone get the healer," he ordered, his voice carrying an urgency that made every guard in the yard jump to obey. "Now." "I am all right," Lila said, though her voice shook as much as her hands did. "Please, see to the child first." "The child is unharmed," Ashton said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You are not." He lifted her carefully into his arms, ignoring the startled murmurs rising from the gathering crowd of guards and servants who had rushed toward the noise. Lila stiffened, embarrassed and confused by the sudden closeness, but she was too weak from shock and blood loss to protest, as he carried her swiftly toward the healer's quarters inside the main hall. Word of what happened spread through the palace faster than fire through dry grass. By mid-morning, everyone from the stable boys to the highest-ranking elders had heard some version of the story, that the new king, married only one day, had shifted in front of witnesses to save a servant girl from a wolf attack, and had carried her through the halls himself, rather than allowing anyone else to do it. Serafina heard the story from 3 different sources before noon, each version slightly more dramatic than the last, and by the time Ashton finally returned to their shared chambers that evening, her expression was carefully composed, giving away nothing of what she truly felt. "I heard there was an incident in the training yard," she said, watching him closely as he removed his outer coat. "A servant girl was injured, protecting a child from a loose wolf," Ashton said simply. "I intervened. It was my duty as Alpha to protect anyone within these walls." "Of course," Serafina agreed smoothly. "Your duty." But she noticed, as she always noticed everything, the way his eyes had grown distant and unfocused, the way his mind seemed to remain somewhere else entirely, even as his body stood in the same room as hers. She had married a king for power and position, understanding perfectly well that love was not guaranteed to come with the title. She had prepared herself for a marriage built on respect and partnership rather than passion. What she had not prepared for was the possibility that her husband's attention might already belong to someone else, even if he himself did not yet understand why. Meanwhile, in the healer's quarters, Lila lay on a narrow cot, while an elderly woman named Agatha cleaned and stitched the wound on her shoulder. Agatha had served as the pack's healer and shaman for longer than anyone could remember, and her weathered hands worked with practiced efficiency even as her sharp eyes studied Lila's face with an intensity that made the younger woman uncomfortable. "You are fortunate the wound is not deeper," Agatha said. "Another inch and you might have lost use of your arm entirely. Thank you for tending to it," Lila said quietly. Agatha did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair away from Lila's face, tilting her head slightly as though examining something beyond the surface of her skin. Her expression flickered just briefly, with something that looked almost like recognition, before smoothing back into professional calm. "Have we met before, child?" Agatha asked carefully. "Somewhere long ago?" Lila blinked, startled by the question. "I do not believe so. I have lived within these walls since I was a small girl. I would remember meeting someone as respected as yourself." "Yes," Agatha murmured, almost to herself. "Perhaps you would remember. Perhaps that is exactly the trouble." Before Lila could ask what she meant, Agatha straightened and busied herself with wrapping fresh bandages around the stitched wound, her expression once again unreadable. Lila let the strange comment pass, assuming it was simply the tired mutterings of an old woman who had spent too many hours awake tending to injuries. She did not know that Agatha's hands had trembled slightly while applying that final bandage, nor that the old shaman had recognized, in that single unguarded moment, features she herself had once helped to erase from 2 separate minds many years before. Agatha said nothing more that evening. Guilt, long buried, was not so easily spoken aloud, especially not to the very person it had wronged. That night, Unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Lila found herself walking slowly through the quiet garden behind the servants' quarters, her injured shoulder aching beneath its bandages. The moon hung low and full above the palace walls, casting silver light across the rows of flowering bushes that Eleanor tended so carefully each spring. She did not hear Ashton approach until he was standing only a few feet away. "You should be resting," he said, his voice low. Lila startled and turned quickly, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. "Your Majesty, I did not expect you to be walking these gardens tonight." "I could not sleep," he admitted, stepping closer despite every instinct telling him to keep his distance from a woman who was not his wife. "I wanted to see for myself that you were recovering well." "I am recovering fine," Lila said, though her heart was pounding loud enough that she feared he might hear it. "Thank you for saving Grace, and for saving me as well." "You saved her first," Ashton said. "I only finished what your courage had already started." They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with something neither of them fully understood. Lila found herself studying his face in the moonlight, searching for reasons why looking at him felt less like meeting a stranger, and more like remembering an old, half-forgotten dream. "Have we met before?" she asked suddenly, echoing without realizing it, the very question Agatha had asked her only hours earlier. "Before yesterday, I mean. Before the wedding." Ashton's breath caught. The question struck something deep inside him, a feeling of falling backward into darkness, searching for a memory that seemed to hover just out of reach, close enough to sense but too far to grasp. "I do not think so," he said slowly. And yet, Lila repeated softly, understanding exactly what he meant without needing further explanation. Neither of them spoke the word that hovered unspoken between them, the ancient word that every wolf shifter instinctively recognized in their bones long before their minds could accept it. Mate. It would have been improper, impossible, unthinkable to say it aloud. Not one day after his wedding to another woman, not when duty and law and years of careful arrangement stood firmly between them. And so Ashton simply nodded once, wished her a peaceful recovery, and turned to walk back toward the palace, leaving Lila alone in the moonlit garden with her heart racing and her mind full of questions that had no answers yet. She did not know that somewhere inside the palace walls, an old shaman lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling of her small chamber, wrestling with a guilt she had carried silently for years, and a secret that was growing far too large to stay buried much longer. Serafina found the shattered mirror before she found the answer she was looking for, and the sound of it breaking beneath her fist echoed through her private chamber like a warning she refused to heed. She had spent 3 days quietly gathering information about the servant girl her husband could not stop thinking about, and every piece she uncovered only deepened her unease. Lila Hart, an orphan taken in as a child, raised in the kitchens, no family, no pack standing, nothing that should have made her worth a second glance from a king. And yet Ashton had glanced at her more than twice, more than a dozen times in fact, according to the servant Serafina had quietly questioned. She was not a foolish woman. She understood the difference between simple attraction and something far more dangerous. "You believe it is a bond," her father said that evening, when she finally confided her suspicions to him in a private letter she had sent by messenger hawk to the Vale territory. Edwin Vale arrived within 2 days, his expression grim as he sat across from his daughter in the quiet study she had claimed as her own within the Cole Palace. "I believe it is something," Serafina said carefully. "I have seen the way he looks at her. It is not the way a man looks at a servant he barely notices. Mate bonds do not simply appear out of nowhere between two strangers who have never met," Edwin said, though his tone lacked full conviction. "Unless, of course, they are not strangers at all." Serafina's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting nothing," Edwin said, choosing his words with the caution of a man who understood politics better than almost anyone alive. "I am simply noting that memories can be altered when the need is great enough, and the shaman skilled enough. It happened more often during the border wars than most people realize. Difficult decisions, made for the good of many, sometimes required difficult methods." The implications settled over Serafina like a weight she had not expected to carry. If her father was right, if some hidden history existed between Ashton and this servant girl, then the mysterious pull drawing them together was not something new at all. It was something old, something buried, something that could resurface no matter how carefully it had once been hidden away. "What would you have me do?" Serafina asked quietly. "Nothing, for now," Edwin said. "Watch, wait, learn everything you can. Knowledge is worth more than any hasty action, especially in matters as delicate as this one. If there is truth to uncover, we will find it, and we will decide together how best to use it." Serafina agreed, though the promise sat uneasily in her chest. She had not married Ashton Cole for love, she reminded herself firmly, staring at her own reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. She had married him for position, for security, for the future strength of both their packs combined into one unstoppable force. Whatever feelings existed or did not exist between them personally were, in the grand calculation of her life, secondary concerns. And yet, some small and unwelcome part of her could not deny the sting of being second in her own husband's heart before their marriage had even properly begun. Meanwhile, unaware of the quiet investigation building around her, Lila continued her work in the kitchens exactly as she always had, though her thoughts strayed more often than they should have toward the strange conversation she'd shared with Ashton in the moonlit garden. She told herself repeatedly that nothing could come of it, that whatever unusual feeling passed between them was simply a coincidence, a trick of exhaustion and stress following her injury. But the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing day, an ache in her chest whenever she caught sight of him across the courtyard, a warmth spreading through her whenever their paths crossed even briefly in the halls. One afternoon, while delivering fresh linens to the private study where Agatha often worked preparing remedies and treatments for the household, Lila found the old shaman bent over an ancient leather book, her weathered fingers tracing lines of faded ink with careful attention. "May I ask you something, Agatha?" Lila said, setting the linens down on a nearby table. "Of course, child. Do you believe it is possible to feel a connection to someone you have truly never met before? A pull, almost, that has no explanation." Agatha's hands stilled over the pages of her book. For a long moment she said nothing, and Lila wondered if she had overstepped some boundary by asking such a personal question of someone so respected within the pack. "Among our kind," Agatha finally said, her voice carefully measured, "there exists a bond deeper than friendship, deeper even than love, as most people understand the word. We call it the mate bond. It connects two souls so completely that even time, distance, or circumstance cannot fully sever it. Some believe it can survive even the loss of memory itself." Lila's breath caught. The loss of memory? "In rare and difficult cases," Agatha said slowly, choosing each word with obvious care, "a bond can be hidden from the minds of those who share it, through certain old and dangerous practices. But hiding something is not the same as destroying it. The bond remains, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right circumstance to bring it back into the light." "Why would anyone hide such a thing?" Lila asked, genuinely confused. Surely finding a true mate would be a blessing, not something to erase. Agatha's expression grew distant, haunted by something clearly personal. "Sometimes, child, the needs of many are placed above the happiness of few. Sometimes those in power make choices they believe necessary, even when those choices cause great and lasting harm to the people involved. It is not my place to say more than this." Lila studied the old woman's face, sensing there was far more hidden beneath her carefully chosen words than she was willing to reveal. But she did not push further, sensing that whatever guilt weighed on Agatha's conscience was not yet ready to be spoken aloud, even to the very person it might concern most directly. She gathered the empty basket and left the study, her mind spinning with questions she could not begin to answer. The idea that a bond could exist and be hidden, that memories themselves could be stolen away by those with the power and the desperation to do so, planted a seed of unease deep within her that she could not shake for the rest of the day. That evening, Ashton found himself once again unable to focus on the pile of reports and requests waiting on his desk, matters of trade routes and border patrols and grain shipments that should have commanded his full attention. Instead, his mind kept drifting back to the moonlit garden, to the question Lila had asked him, to the strange and undeniable pull he felt whenever she was near. He summoned Agatha to his private study late that night, hoping the old shaman might offer some explanation for the feelings he could not shake. "Tell me plainly," he said, once the door was closed and they were alone. "Is it possible for a mate bond to exist without either party fully realizing it, to feel a pull towards someone without understanding why?" Agatha's face remained carefully composed, though her hands folded a bit too tightly in her lap. "It is possible," she said slowly. "Bonds do not always announce themselves immediately. Sometimes recognition takes time to fully surface, especially if circumstances have interfered with the natural connection between two souls." "What kind of circumstances?" Agatha hesitated, longer than any innocent answer should have required. "Many kinds, my king. Distance, fear, duty. The heart does not always follow a straight path toward what it needs most." Ashton studied her closely, sensing an evasion in her careful phrasing that he could not quite name. But exhaustion and the weight of his new responsibilities pressed heavily upon him, and he did not have the energy that night to press the matter further. "Thank you, Agatha," he said finally. That will be all. She rose and left quickly, her steps a little too hurried for a woman of her age and calm reputation, and Ashton was left alone once again with his unanswered questions and the persistent, aching certainty that something important had been kept from him for far too long. Outside in the corridor, Agatha leaned against the cold stone wall and pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her heart pounding with a guilt she had carried silently for years. She had performed the memory removal herself, at the desperate request of a dying king who believed it necessary to save his kingdom from collapse. She had told herself for years that it was the right decision, the only decision, made for the good of everyone involved. But watching Ashton and Lila circle each other now, drawn together by a force even her own careful work could not fully erase, she understood with growing certainty that some mistakes could not simply be buried and forgotten. Sooner or later, the truth would find its way back to the surface, no matter how deeply it had once been hidden. And when that day came, she feared, none of them would be prepared for what it would cost. Lightning cracked across the sky the night Ashton finally remembered everything, and the force of the memory hit him with the same violence as the storm outside his window. He had gone to bed exhausted after another long day of council meetings, his mind still tangled with unanswered questions about bonds and buried feelings. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally arrived, it dragged him backward through time, to a night nearly 6 years earlier, a night he had believed, until this very moment, had never truly happened. In the dream he was younger, only 20 years old, riding along the border of his father's territory with a small patrol during a tense standoff with a rival pack from the eastern hills. A skirmish had broken out unexpectedly near a small village, and in the chaos, he had become separated from his men, wounded and alone in unfamiliar woods as darkness fell. A young woman had found him there, hidden among the trees, tending a small fire she had built for warmth. She had no pack markings, no obvious allegiance, only a quiet kindness in her eyes as she cleaned his wounds with steady, careful hands and shared what little food she carried. Her name was Lila. They had talked through the entire night, sheltering together until his men could find him again at dawn. And somewhere during those long, quiet hours, surrounded by nothing but firelight and the sounds of the forest, they had recognized each other completely, in the way only true mates could. He remembered the moment with perfect clarity now, the way his wolf had gone utterly silent with certainty, the way her eyes had widened with the same undeniable recognition. They had made promises that night, quiet ones, whispered between two young hearts who believed they had found something rare and unbreakable. Ashton woke gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart pounding as though he had just relived the moment rather than merely dreamed it. He sat upright in the darkness, memories flooding back with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not imagination. This was truth, buried for years beneath something far more deliberate than simple forgetting. He remembered, too, what had happened afterward. His father, Nathaniel, gravely injured in the same conflict and dying slowly from wounds that would never heal, had learned of the bond upon Ashton's return to the palace. Rather than celebrating his son's fortune and finding a true mate, Nathaniel had grown desperate and afraid, insisting that the alliance with the Vale Pack, already carefully arranged through years of diplomacy, could not be abandoned for the sake of one unexpected connection with an unknown woman of no standing. Ashton remembered arguing fiercely against his father's wishes, remembered declaring that he would honor his bond no matter the political cost. But his father had been dying, and desperation had made him ruthless. He had summoned Agatha in secret and demanded she use the old, forbidden methods to erase the memory of the bond from both his son's mind and the young woman's, believing it the only way to save the kingdom from the chaos of a broken alliance. Ashton remembered fighting against it, remembered the shaman's reluctant hands, remembered the darkness closing over his thoughts like water swallowing a drowning man. And then, nothing. Years of nothing, until this very night, when the storm outside seemed to shake something loose deep within his mind that had been waiting all along to break free. He rose from his bed immediately, dressing quickly despite the late hour, and made his way through the quiet palace halls, toward Agatha's private chamber. He knocked once before pushing the door open without waiting for a response. Agatha sat awake by candlelight, as though she had been expecting him. "You remember?" she said quietly, not a question at all. "Everything," Ashton said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fury and heartbreak he had never before directed at the woman who had served his family faithfully for decades. "I remember all of it, the border, the fire, Lila. I remember my father's orders, and I remember you following them." Agatha lowered her eyes, unable to meet his gaze. "I did what I believed was necessary, my king. Your father was dying. He feared the collapse of everything he had built, Everything meant to protect thousands of lives across both territories. He believed the sacrifice of one bond was a small price to secure lasting peace. It was not his sacrifice to make, Ashton said, his voice raw. It was mine, and hers. You were young, Agatha said softly, and grieving, and torn between duty and desire, in a way few men your age are ever forced to endure. Your father believed, in his final days, that he was protecting you from a choice that would tear the kingdom apart. I do not say this to excuse what I did. I say it only so that you understand the desperation behind it. Ashton sank into the chair across from her, the anger draining out of him, and leaving only exhaustion and grief in its place. Does she remember as well? Has anything returned to her mind? I do not know, Agatha admitted. The bond itself cannot be destroyed, only hidden. Given enough closeness, enough time, enough triggering moments, memories sometimes resurface on their own, exactly as they seem to be resurfacing within you now. It is possible hers will return as well, in time. I have to tell her, Ashton said firmly. She deserves to know the truth, whatever the consequences. And Serafina? Agatha asked gently. What will you tell your wife, married only days ago in front of hundreds of witnesses from two powerful packs? The question landed like a physical blow. Ashton had no answer ready, no path forward that did not risk shattering the fragile peace his marriage was meant to secure. He sat in silence for a long moment, torn between the truth clawing to escape his chest and the responsibility resting heavily on his shoulders as king. I do not know, he admitted finally. But I know I cannot continue pretending nothing exists between us. It would be a lie, to her, to Serafina, and to myself. Agatha said nothing further, understanding better than anyone the impossible position her king now found himself trapped within. She had spent years believing her actions had protected the kingdom from unnecessary chaos, but watching Ashton now, hollowed out by grief and longing he had been denied the right to even understand, she wondered whether the true cost of her choices had only been delayed rather than avoided entirely. The following morning, Ashton sought Lila out in the quiet hours before the household fully woke, finding her alone in the garden where they had spoken once before beneath the moonlight. She looked up in surprise as he approached, her expression shifting quickly into careful, practiced neutrality, the mask every servant learned to wear around nobility. Your Majesty, she said, bowing her head slightly. Is something wrong? Lila, Ashton said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. Do you remember a night, many years ago, near the eastern border? A skirmish, and a fire in the woods? Her breath caught sharply, her eyes widening with something between confusion and dawning recognition. I do not understand what you mean, she said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty rather than confidence. Think carefully, Ashton pressed gently, stepping closer. A wounded stranger, found by a young woman with no pack markings, who tended his injuries through the night and shared her fire until dawn. Lila's hand rose slowly to her chest, as though pressing against a sudden ache she could not explain. Fragments flickered at the edges of her mind, faint and blurry, like images glimpsed underwater. A fire, a stranger's face, a promise whispered in the dark that she could almost remember making. I feel as though I should know what you are describing, she whispered, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, but I cannot see it clearly. It is like reaching for something just beyond my fingertips. It happened, Ashton said softly. It happened between us, Lila. You are my true mate, and our memories of that night, of everything we promised each other, were taken from us both, deliberately, by people who believed they were protecting something more important than our own hearts. The garden fell utterly silent around them, the weight of his words settling over Lila like the first heavy snowfall of winter, cold and undeniable, and impossible to ignore any longer. The letter arrived sealed with wax the color of dried blood, and Serafina's hands shook as she broke it open in the privacy of her chamber. Her father's spy within the palace, a quiet stable hand loyal to the Vale family long before he had ever served the Cole household, had written only a few lines, but they were enough to confirm every fear Serafina had carried since her wedding day. The king had been seen in the garden at dawn, speaking closely with the servant girl, both of them visibly shaken by whatever words passed between them. A guard stationed nearby had overheard fragments, enough to understand that old memories were somehow involved, memories of a night long before the marriage had ever been arranged. Serafina read the letter 3 times before setting it carefully into the fire, watching the parchment curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. She summoned her father immediately, and within a day, Edwin Vale arrived once again at the Cole Palace, his expression grim as his daughter recounted everything she had learned. A hidden mate bond, Edwin said slowly, absorbing the full weight of the revelation. Erased memories. This changes everything, Serafina. If word of this reaches the other elders, the marriage itself could be challenged. Ancient law is very clear regarding mate bonds. A king cannot be forced to remain bound to a political marriage if a true mate is discovered, even one hidden through unnatural means. Then we must ensure word does not reach the elders, Serafina said firmly, though something uncertain flickered behind her composed expression. Whatever exists between them, it changes nothing about the alliance our families have built. I will not be cast aside because of a mistake made years before I was even considered as a bride. Careful, daughter, Edwin warned. Mate bonds are not simple political inconveniences to be dismissed. They run deeper than duty, deeper than ambition. If the elders confirm the bond is genuine, opposing it could cost you far more than dignity. It could cost you your safety. Serafina straightened her spine, refusing to let fear show on her face even in front of her own father. I did not fight my way into this position simply to surrender it without a battle. There must be a way to manage this situation quietly, before it grows beyond our control. What do you propose? The girl must be removed, Serafina said, her voice cold and deliberate. Not harmed, I am not suggesting violence, but sent far away, given a new position in a distant territory, anything that puts sufficient distance between her and Ashton before this bond has the chance to fully take root. Distance weakens even the strongest connections, does it not? Edwin considered this carefully. It is possible, though risky, if Ashton discovers your involvement. Then we ensure he does not discover it, Serafina said. Leave the arrangements to me. Meanwhile, unaware of the plans forming quietly against her, Lila spent the following days in a haze of confusion and quiet grief. The fragments of memory Ashton's words had stirred within her mind remained frustratingly incomplete, flickering images and half-remembered feelings that refused to fully resolve into clarity. She knew, in her heart, that something significant had happened between them long ago, but she could not yet grasp the whole truth of it, and the uncertainty left her feeling unmoored in a way she had never experienced before. She confided finally in Beatrice, a fellow kitchen servant and one of the few people within the palace Lila trusted enough to call a true friend. They had grown up together within the Cole household, both taken in as young orphans with no pack standing of their own, and their shared history had forged a bond of quiet loyalty between them over the years. You truly believe the king is your mate? Beatrice asked one evening, keeping her voice low as they worked together preparing the evening meal. I do not know what to believe, Lila admitted. I only know that something feels true when I am near him, something I cannot explain through simple attraction alone. And Agatha spoke of bonds being hidden through certain old practices. It frightens me, Beatrice, how much sense it all makes, even though I have no clear memory to confirm any of it. If it is true, Beatrice said carefully, what will you do? He is married now, married to a woman with the full backing of a powerful pack. Even if the bond is real, even if the elders eventually confirm it, are you prepared for what claiming that truth would mean, the danger it would bring you? Lila had no answer ready. She had spent her entire life learning to remain small, unremarkable, careful never to draw attention that might threaten the fragile safety she had built within the palace walls. The idea of stepping forward, of claiming a bond with the king himself, of standing against the political marriage that united two of the most powerful packs in the region, terrified her more than she wanted to admit even to her closest friend. I do not know, she finally whispered. I only know that ignoring it does not make the ache in my chest disappear. If anything, it grows stronger with each day that passes. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace messenger, a young man Lila recognized only vaguely, carrying a folded note bearing the official seal of the household steward. Lila Hart, the messenger said formally. You are requested to report to the steward's office first thing tomorrow morning. A new position has become available within the northern outpost, and your name has been put forward for immediate transfer. Lila's stomach dropped. A transfer? I have never requested reassignment. The decision was made by household leadership, the messenger said simply, offering no further explanation before departing to deliver his remaining messages elsewhere. Beatrice's eyes met Lila's with immediate suspicion. This is no coincidence, she said quietly. Someone wants you removed from the palace, and quickly. Lila's mind raced, piecing together the timing of events with growing dread. The transfer notice had arrived only days after her conversation with Ashton in the garden. Only days after fragments of forbidden memory had begun resurfacing between them. It required no great leap of logic to understand who might benefit most from her sudden absence. She spent a restless, sleepless night wrestling with the decision before her. She could comply quietly, accept the transfer, disappear into a distant outpost, and allow whatever fragile connection existed between herself and Ashton to fade slowly into nothing, as distance and time so often accomplished. It would be the safe choice, the choice that avoided conflict, danger, and the impossible complications of challenging a marriage between two powerful pack families. Or she could refuse, could seek out Ashton and tell him what she suspected, could risk everything by standing firm in the face of a decision clearly designed to separate them before the truth could fully surface. By morning, exhausted from her sleepless night but resolved in her decision, Lila made her way not to the steward's office, but directly toward the king's private study, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination she had never before allowed herself to feel. Ashton looked up in surprise as she entered without waiting to be formally announced, closing the heavy door quietly behind her. "Lila, what has happened?" "I have been ordered to transfer to the northern outpost," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Effective immediately. I do not believe this decision came from household leadership acting alone." Ashton's expression darkened immediately, understanding settling over his features with grim clarity. "Serafina," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I do not wish to cause trouble within your household, Your Majesty," Lila continued carefully, "but I also do not wish to simply disappear, not when so much remains unresolved between us. I deserve to understand the truth of what happened to me, to us, before I am sent away to a place where I may never learn it at all." Ashton crossed the room and took her hands gently in his own, the same electric warmth passing between them that had marked every previous encounter. "You will not be transferred," he said firmly. "I will address this matter personally, today, whatever the political cost may be." "And Serafina?" Lila asked softly. "I do not yet know what I will say to my wife," Ashton admitted, "but I know I will not allow fear of consequence to erase the truth a second time. That mistake was made once already, at great cost to us both. I will not permit it to be repeated." Outside the study door, unseen by either of them, Agatha stood quietly in the shadowed hallway, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand that the careful balance holding the palace together was beginning, at last, to crack under the weight of truths too long buried to remain hidden any further. The council chamber doors slammed open before anyone had finished speaking, and every head turned as Ashton strode inside with a fury few had ever witnessed from their normally composed king. "Cancel the transfer order," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room full of startled elders and advisors. "Immediately." Marcus, the gray-haired elder who had spoken the binding words at Ashton's wedding only weeks earlier, rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table. "My king, the transfer was arranged through proper household channels. May I ask what has prompted such urgency regarding one servant's reassignment?" "The servant in question is Lila Hart," Ashton said, his jaw tight, "and I have reason to believe she carries a hidden mate bond with me, one deliberately erased from both our memories years ago by order of my late father." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Several elders exchanged uneasy glances, while others simply stared at their king in open disbelief. Marcus's expression, however, remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing of whatever thoughts churned behind his composed features. "That is a serious claim, my king," Marcus said carefully. "Mate bonds are sacred among our kind, but so too are the alliances forged through marriage. If what you say is true, it creates a conflict our laws were never designed to easily resolve. Then perhaps our laws require reconsideration," Ashton said firmly. "I did not choose to abandon this bond willingly. It was stolen from me before I ever had the chance to honor it properly. I will not allow that theft to be compounded by further injustice against the woman it was stolen from." An older elder named Harold, seated near the far end of the table, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "With respect, Your Majesty, regardless of the circumstances surrounding its erasure, the marriage to Serafina Vale was conducted properly and witnessed by hundreds. Overturning it now risks igniting conflict between our pack and the Vale territory, a conflict that could prove costly for everyone under your protection." "I understand the risk," Ashton said. "I do not take it lightly, but I will not sacrifice a second time what belongs rightfully to Lila Hart and myself, simply because acknowledging the truth proves inconvenient for political stability." The debate that followed stretched long into the afternoon, elders arguing fiercely on both sides of the issue. Some, moved by the clear injustice of Ashton's stolen memories, argued strongly in favor of recognizing the bond and finding some peaceful resolution with the Vale family. Others, more concerned with immediate political stability, pushed hard for containing the situation quietly, suggesting that Lila be relocated regardless of the bond's authenticity, allowing time and distance to resolve what direct confrontation could not. Marcus, Throughout the entire debate, remained curiously quiet, offering little of his own opinion while listening carefully to every argument presented. It was only near the end of the session, as the council began preparing to adjourn without reaching any firm resolution, that he finally spoke again. "I would suggest a compromise," Marcus said. "Allow Agatha to formally confirm the existence and authenticity of this bond before any further action is taken. If the bond proves genuine, we will convene a full council session to determine the appropriate path forward, taking into account both ancient law and present political necessity. Until that confirmation is complete, the servant will remain within the palace, though her transfer will be indefinitely postponed rather than fully cancelled, to avoid the appearance of favoritism before all facts are properly established." It was not everything Ashton wanted, but it was enough to prevent Lila's immediate removal, and after a moment's consideration, he agreed to the terms. The council session ended, and word spread quickly throughout the palace that the king himself had intervened personally to halt a servant's reassignment, fueling rumors and speculation that grew wilder with each retelling. Serafina received the news of the council session with outward calm that masked a storm of fury building steadily beneath the surface. She confronted Ashton directly that evening in their shared chambers, her composed mask slipping for the first time since their wedding day. "You went before the entire council," she said, "to defend a servant girl's position within this household. Do you understand how this appears, Ashton? To me, to my family, to every elder now questioning the stability of our marriage." "I understand it appears exactly as it is," Ashton said quietly. "Serafina, I owe you honesty, whatever the cost to our arrangement. Lila and I share a mate bond, hidden from us both through my father's desperate choices years ago. I did not seek this out. I did not plan to hurt you by discovering it. But I cannot continue pretending it does not exist." Serafina's hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of a truth she had already suspected, but hoped desperately to avoid confirming. "And what of our marriage? What of the alliance our families built specifically to secure peace and stability across both territories?" "I do not know yet what becomes of our marriage," Ashton admitted honestly. "I know only that I cannot deny what exists between Lila and myself, nor can I in good conscience allow her to be quietly removed simply to protect appearances. Whatever resolution we find, it must be one built on truth rather than continued deception." Serafina turned away from him, staring out the tall window overlooking the moonlit courtyard where their wedding celebration had taken place only weeks before. "I did not ask for love when I agreed to this marriage," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I asked only for respect, and for a partnership built on mutual benefit. I did not expect to be humiliated by a bond I had no part in creating, nor any way to compete against." "You are not being humiliated by my choice," Ashton said gently, stepping closer though careful not to close the distance completely. "You are being caught, as I am, in the wreckage of a decision made by others long before either of us had any say in the matter. I do not wish to see you hurt by this, Serafina. Whatever comes next, I intend to handle it with as much fairness and honesty as circumstances allow." Serafina said nothing further that evening, and Ashton eventually retreated to his own separate chamber, giving her the space she clearly needed to process the shattering of expectations she had carried since her wedding day. Alone in the darkness, Serafina finally allowed herself a moment of quiet, private grief, mourning not a love she had never truly possessed, but the secure future she had believed was finally within her grasp. By morning, however, her grief had hardened once again into careful calculation. She summoned her father a final time, and together they began drafting a new strategy, one that no longer relied on quietly removing Lila from the palace, but on ensuring that whatever council decision eventually emerged regarding the bond, the Vale family's interests remained protected regardless of the outcome. "If the bond cannot be denied," Edwin said grimly, "then we must ensure the political cost of acknowledging it favors us rather than harms us. There are ways to renegotiate terms, daughter, even terms as significant as a royal marriage, if approached with sufficient skill and leverage." Serafina listened carefully, her mind already turning toward possibilities she had not previously considered. Perhaps, she realized slowly, survival in this new and complicated situation required something other than desperate opposition to a bond she could not defeat. Perhaps it required instead the same careful strategy that had guided every important decision of her life thus far. Whatever came next, she resolved silently. She would not allow herself to be discarded without securing something valuable in return. A hooded figure slipped through the servants' corridor just after midnight, moving with the careful silence of someone who had planned every step of the journey in advance, and Beatrice nearly screamed when she stumbled upon them near the storage cellars. "Who is there?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fear as she raised the small lantern she carried. The figure lowered their hood, revealing the weathered, guilt-stricken face of the elder Marcus. Beatrice's confusion only deepened at the sight of him, alone and clearly nervous, in a part of the palace no elder had any obvious business visiting so late at night. "I need to speak with Lila Hart," Marcus said quietly, urgently and privately. Beatrice hesitated, torn between suspicion and the obvious desperation written across the old elder's features. Eventually, cautious but curious, she agreed to fetch her friend, and within a quarter hour, Lila stood facing Marcus in the dim candlelight of the empty kitchen, unsure what to expect from this unusual and unexpected encounter. "I have information you deserve to know," Marcus said without preamble, "information that may explain far more than even the king himself currently understands." "What information?" Lila asked carefully. Marcus drew a slow breath, steadying himself before continuing. "I served as advisor to Nathaniel Cole for many years, long before his death. I was present, though reluctantly, when he first learned of the bond between his son and a young woman with no pack standing. I argued against his decision at the time, though ultimately I lacked the courage to stop him from proceeding. I have carried that guilt for many years." "You knew," Lila said slowly, understanding dawning across her features. "You knew about the memory erasure from the very beginning." "I did," Marcus admitted, shame heavy in his voice. "And I have watched, these past weeks, as fragments of that stolen bond have begun resurfacing between yourself and the king, unable to decide whether speaking the full truth would help or further complicate an already delicate situation. I have finally decided that continued silence serves no one, least of all you, who suffered the greatest loss without ever understanding why." He proceeded to explain everything he remembered from that difficult time, filling in gaps that even Agatha's guarded explanations had left incomplete. He spoke of Nathaniel's desperation as his health failed rapidly following the border conflict, of his fear that abandoning the Vale Alliance would leave the kingdom vulnerable to attack from rival packs eager to exploit any sign of weakness. He spoke of the arguments that had raged within the palace walls before the fateful decision was finally made, and of his own regret at failing to intervene more forcefully on behalf of two young people, whose lives were irrevocably altered by choices made entirely without their consent. "Why tell me this now?" Lila asked, tears gathering in her eyes, as the full weight of the stolen years settled over her. "Because the council will soon convene to determine your fate, and the fate of the bond you share with our king," Marcus said. "And I believe you deserve to enter that discussion fully informed, rather than continuing to stumble through fragments and half-truths, offered reluctantly by those too afraid or too guilty to speak plainly." Lila absorbed his words in silence, grief and anger, and a strange, aching relief mixing together within her chest. She had spent her entire life believing herself entirely alone in the world, an orphan with no family, no history worth remembering, no connection to anything beyond the walls of the kitchen where she worked each day, learning that an entire chapter of her life had been stolen, that she had once known love and made promises and dreamed of a future that had been ripped away before she ever had the chance to remember it, filled her with a grief so profound she could barely draw breath around it. "Thank you for telling me," she finally whispered. "Even now, even this late, it means more than you understand." Marcus nodded once, some small measure of relief visible in his tired features, before slipping back into the shadows and returning to his own quarters, leaving Lila alone with the enormous weight of everything she had just learned. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she wandered the quiet halls of the palace until she found herself standing outside Agatha's private chamber, knocking softly despite the late hour. The old shaman opened the door almost immediately, as though she too had been lying awake, anticipating exactly this confrontation. "You know everything now," Agatha said quietly, reading the answer clearly in Lila's expression before a single word passed between them. "I know that you performed the erasure yourself," Lila said, her voice trembling with barely restrained emotion. "I know you took something precious from me before I ever had the chance to understand what I was losing." "I did," Agatha said, offering no excuse, no attempt to soften the weight of her confession. "I acted under the direct order of a dying king, believing at the time that I was protecting far more lives than the two I was harming. I have questioned that belief many times over the years since, and I question it more deeply now than ever before." "Do you understand what you took from me?" Lila asked, her voice breaking. "Not simply memories, but years. Years I might have spent knowing love, understanding my own worth, believing myself capable of being cherished by someone, rather than merely tolerated within a kitchen that was never truly my home. You took all of that, and you gave me nothing in return except confusion and an ache I could never explain." Agatha lowered her head, accepting the accusation without protest. I cannot return what was taken, child. I cannot undo the years already lost. I can only offer my genuine sorrow, and whatever assistance I am able to provide now, as the truth finally comes to light. Lila stood silently for a long moment, wrestling with anger and grief that felt too large to contain within her small frame. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fury, and she simply nodded once before turning to leave, unable to find any words adequate to the moment. She did not return to the servants' quarters that night. Instead, she walked out through the palace gates and into the surrounding countryside, needing distance, needing space to breathe freely away from walls that suddenly felt suffocating with secrets she had spent her entire life unaware of. By morning, her absence had been noticed, and a quiet search began throughout the palace grounds, though no one yet understood the full weight of grief that had driven her away, nor how far she intended to go before she found the strength to return. Ashton tore through the palace like a man possessed the moment word reached him that Lila had vanished sometime before dawn. He questioned every servant, every guard stationed near the gates, every stable hand who might have witnessed her departure. But the answers offered little comfort. She had walked out sometime after midnight, alone, without informing anyone of her destination, and no one had seen which direction she had taken once she passed beyond the outer walls. She could be anywhere by now, Daniel, the captain of the palace guard, said grimly as he organized search parties to comb the surrounding countryside. The forests stretch for miles in every direction, and there are rival territories not far beyond our borders where a lone traveler could easily find trouble. Then we search every mile of those forests if necessary, Ashton said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. I want every available guard mobilized immediately. Beatrice, summoned for questioning alongside the other servants, finally broke down and revealed what she knew of the previous night's events, describing Marcus's late-night visit and the devastating conversation that had followed. Ashton's expression darkened further upon learning the full scope of what Lila had discovered, understanding immediately the crushing weight of grief that must have driven her from the only home she had ever known. He found Agatha next, demanding to know exactly what had passed between herself and Lila during their final conversation. She knows everything now, Agatha admitted quietly. The full truth of what was taken from her, and from you. I do not know where her grief has led her, my king, but I understand well enough why she needed to leave these walls, even if only for a time. Ashton set out himself alongside the search parties, refusing to remain within the palace, while Lila remained missing somewhere beyond its protection. His wolf howled with restless urgency beneath his human form, the bond pulling at him with an intensity that made remaining calm nearly impossible. They searched throughout the day without success, the forest offering no clear sign of which direction she had traveled. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the countryside, Ashton found himself growing increasingly desperate, his mind conjuring every possible danger that might have befallen her alone, and grieving in unfamiliar territory. It was Agatha, arriving late to join the search effort, who finally offered a suggestion that redirected their entire approach. The eastern border, she said, catching up to Ashton near the edge of the western forest where most of the search had concentrated, where the two of you first met, all those years ago. If old memories are resurfacing within her, perhaps instinct has drawn her back toward the place where everything began, even without conscious understanding of why. Ashton considered this immediately, recognizing the wisdom in Agatha's suggestion. He redirected his own search away from the western forests and toward the distant eastern border, riding hard through the remaining daylight hours and well into the night, driven forward by a certainty he could not fully explain beyond the insistent pull of the bond guiding him onward. He found her finally, just before dawn, sitting alone beside the remains of a small fire near the very clearing where their story had first begun, years earlier, before either of their memories had been stolen away. She looked up as he approached, exhaustion and grief evident across her tear-streaked features, though something in her expression shifted at the sight of him, a flicker of recognition deeper than any she had experienced in recent weeks. I remember, she said softly, before he could speak a single word. Not everything, not completely, but enough. I remember this place. I remember the fire, and your voice in the darkness, and the way I felt certain, absolutely certain, that I had found something rare and precious that night. Ashton crossed the remaining distance quickly, kneeling beside her without hesitation. I am so sorry, he said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer attempted to hide. Sorry for everything taken from you, for every year you spent believing yourself unloved and unremarkable, when in truth you were cherished long before either of us understood what that word truly meant. It was not your fault, Lila said quietly, though tears continued sliding freely down her cheeks. You did not choose this any more than I did. We were both robbed by decisions made entirely without our consent, by people who believed they understood better than we did what mattered most in our own lives. That does not lessen the pain of what was stolen, Ashton said. But I promise you this, Lila. Whatever happens next, whatever the council decides, whatever cost I must pay politically or personally, I will not allow another moment of our bond to be denied or hidden away again. You deserve far better than a lifetime spent wondering why your heart ached without explanation. They sat together beside the dying embers of her small fire as the sun rose slowly over the eastern hills, filling the sky with soft golden light that mirrored, in some small way, the fragile hope beginning to rebuild between them. Lila leaned gradually into his side, exhaustion finally overtaking the anger and grief that had driven her from the palace, and Ashton wrapped a careful, protective arm around her, holding her close as the morning light grew steadily brighter around them. We must return eventually, Lila said quietly, after a long, comfortable silence had passed between them. The council will still need answers, and Serafina still deserves resolution, whatever form that resolution eventually takes. We will return together, Ashton said firmly. Whatever awaits us within those walls, I do not intend to face it without you standing beside me any longer. They rode back toward the palace as the morning fully bloomed around them, the weight of difficult conversations still ahead of them, but carried now by a renewed strength neither had possessed before finding each other again beside the ashes of an old, rekindled fire. Every elder from both territories had gathered by the time Ashton and Lila arrived back at the palace, summoned urgently the previous evening once word spread that the missing servant had finally been located and was returning alongside the king himself. The great hall, usually reserved for formal celebrations and important ceremonies, had been transformed into a solemn council chamber, long tables arranged in a wide circle to accommodate the significant number of representatives now present. Marcus sat near the front, his expression carrying the weary relief of a man whose long-held secret had finally been released into the open. Agatha stood quietly near the edge of the room, prepared to offer formal confirmation of the bond should the council require it. Serafina sat at the high table alongside her father, her expression carefully composed despite the obvious tension radiating from her rigid posture. She had spent the previous night in careful discussion with Edwin, weighing every possible outcome and preparing herself for whatever direction the council's decision might take. Ashton entered with Lila at his side, refusing to allow her to remain hidden away in the servants' quarters while decisions affecting her entire future were debated in her absence. Murmurs rippled through the gathered elders at the sight of them standing together, though Ashton silenced the room quickly with a single commanding glance. "I have brought Lila Hart before this council," he announced, "because whatever decision is reached here today affects her future as directly as it affects my own. She deserves to stand present for that discussion, rather than waiting anxiously for news delivered secondhand." Marcus rose first, addressing the assembled elders with the quiet authority of a man finally unburdened by years of guilty silence. "I wish to speak plainly regarding events from years past," he began, and proceeded to lay out the full history exactly as he had shared it with Lila days earlier, sparing no detail of Nathaniel Cole's desperate decision and his own regretful failure to prevent it. Agatha followed, confirming formally through ancient ritual methods that the bond between Ashton and Lila was genuine and unmistakable, exactly as authentic as any naturally occurring mate connection recognized throughout their history. Her confirmation, delivered with the full weight of her respected position, left little room for doubt among the assembled representatives. "The bond is confirmed," declared an elder from the Vale delegation, reluctantly acknowledging what the evidence made undeniable. "The question now before this council is what course of action honors both ancient law and present political necessity." It was Serafina who rose next, silencing the murmuring chamber with her sudden movement. All eyes turned toward her, uncertain what position the wronged wife might take in a situation that could easily justify anger, demands for compensation, or outright refusal to accept any resolution beyond the marriage's original terms. "I did not enter this marriage seeking love," Serafina said, her voice steady despite the enormous pressure of the moment. "I entered seeking partnership, strength, and security for both our territories. I will not pretend the discovery of this bond has not wounded my pride, nor will I pretend I welcome the position it now places me within." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "But I am not a woman who clings to what does not belong to her. If the ancient laws recognize this bond as legitimate, then continuing to insist upon a marriage built on stolen circumstances serves no one well, least of all myself. I would rather negotiate new terms that genuinely benefit my family and my people than remain bound to a husband whose heart has always belonged, rightfully, to someone else." The chamber fell into stunned silence at her unexpected declaration. Edwin, seated beside her, offered a small, proud nod, recognizing in his daughter's words the same careful strategic thinking that had guided their family's success for generations. What terms would satisfy the Vale territory? Ashton asked carefully. Should this council determine that the mate bond takes precedence over our current marriage arrangement? Serafina and her father exchanged a brief glance before she answered. A renewed alliance, built on trade agreements and mutual defense pacts rather than marriage, with appropriate compensation reflecting the disruption caused by circumstances entirely outside our family's control. And full acknowledgement, publicly, that the Vale family acted with honor and good faith throughout this entire affair, regardless of how events ultimately concluded. Ashton considered the proposal carefully before responding. I believe those terms are more than reasonable, given everything the Vale family has endured through no fault of their own. I will personally ensure any agreement reached today reflects genuine respect and fair compensation for the position you have been placed within. The negotiations that followed stretched through much of the afternoon, elders from both territories working carefully through the details of a new arrangement that would preserve peace and cooperation between the two powerful pacts, without requiring a marriage neither party any longer wished to maintain. Slowly, methodically, terms were agreed upon, terms that satisfied both the practical political concerns of the assembled representatives and the personal dignity of everyone involved. By evening, as the council finally reached its conclusion, Marcus rose once more to formally announce the decision on behalf of the assembled elders. This council recognizes the mate bond between Alpha King Ashton Cole and Lila Hart as legitimate and binding under ancient law, he declared, his voice carrying clearly throughout the great hall. The marriage between Ashton Cole and Serafina Vale is hereby dissolved by mutual agreement, replaced by a renewed alliance between our territories, built upon trade and mutual defense. Furthermore, this council formally acknowledges the injustice done to both Ashton Cole and Lila Hart through the deliberate erasure of their bond, an act undertaken without their consent under circumstances of desperate necessity that this council does not condone, however sympathetically it may understand the fear that drove it. A ripple of quiet applause spread through the chamber, elders from both territories nodding in acceptance of the carefully negotiated resolution. Serafina rose gracefully, offering a formal bow toward Ashton before departing the chamber alongside her father, her head held high despite the significant shift in her circumstances. She had lost her position as future queen, but she had secured, through her own careful negotiation, a future that preserved both her dignity and her family's continued influence. Lila stood beside Ashton throughout the entire proceeding, overwhelmed by the enormity of everything unfolding around her, scarcely able to believe that the truth she had carried alone for so many years had finally been recognized publicly, formally, by the very council whose ancestors had once conspired to erase it. As the chamber began to empty, Ashton turned to face her fully, taking both her hands gently within his own. "It is done," he said softly. "The truth stands recognized, and nothing remains now to keep us apart." Bells rang out across the entire territory on the morning of the second wedding, carrying across fields and forests in a sound that felt entirely different from the ceremony held only weeks earlier. Lila stood in a small chamber overlooking the courtyard, her hands trembling slightly, as Beatrice carefully fastened the final clasps of her wedding dress, simple compared to the elaborate silk Serafina had worn during the first ceremony, but beautiful in its own quiet way, embroidered along the edges with small silver leaves that caught the morning light. "I never imagined this day would come," Beatrice said softly, adjusting a stray curl of Lila's dark hair. "An orphan kitchen girl, about to become queen. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have laughed." "I still find it difficult to believe myself," Lila admitted, though a genuine smile spread across her features, the first truly carefree smile Beatrice had witnessed from her friend in longer than either of them could remember. "But it feels right, Beatrice. For the first time in my life, everything finally feels exactly as it should." Outside, the courtyard had transformed once again, though this time the atmosphere carried a different energy entirely, warmer somehow, filled with genuine celebration rather than careful political calculation. Representatives from both the Cole and Vale territories attended, their renewed alliance now formally sealed through trade agreements that had proven, in the weeks since the council's decision, remarkably beneficial for both sides. Serafina herself had not returned for the ceremony, having settled instead into a new role helping manage the expanded trade relationships between the two territories, a position that suited her ambitious nature, far better than the quiet duties of a traditional queen ever could have. Agatha stood near the front of the gathered crowd, watching with an expression that mixed lingering guilt with genuine relief at finally witnessing some measure of restoration for the harm she had caused years earlier. She had spent the weeks since the council's decision working closely with both Ashton and Lila, offering whatever assistance she could to help gently restore the remaining fragments of their stolen memories. And slowly, patiently, more details had returned to both of them, filling in gaps that had remained frustratingly incomplete since that first stirring dream weeks before. Marcus, too, stood among the gathered elders, his posture noticeably lighter than it had been in months. The enormous guilt he had carried finally released through his decision to speak the truth when it mattered most. Ashton waited at the front of the courtyard, dressed simply but formally, his expression carrying none of the careful, controlled distance that had marked his first wedding day. When Lila finally emerged from the palace and began walking toward him across the courtyard, he felt his breath catch entirely, the same overwhelming certainty flooding through him that he now remembered feeling, clearly and completely, beside a small campfire many years earlier. The ceremony itself proceeded simply, without the elaborate formality of political alliance building that had characterized his first wedding. Instead, it carried the genuine warmth of two people finally allowed to claim publicly what had always, truly, belonged to them both. "I remember now," Ashton said during his vows, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "Every promise we made beside that fire years ago, promises I believed lost forever, until fate itself refused to let them remain buried. I promise you now, in front of everyone gathered here, that I will never again allow duty or fear to separate us from the truth of what we share." "I remember as well," Lila responded, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in her expression. "Not everything, perhaps, but enough to know that whatever was taken from us, our hearts never truly forgot each other, even through years of silence and confusion. I promise to stand beside you, not as a political convenience, but as the true partner our bond has always intended me to be." As the ceremony concluded, and cheers erupted across the courtyard, Ashton pulled Lila close, and for the first time since that long-ago night beside the fire, they both felt the full weight of their bond settle into place, exactly as it was always meant to, unbroken, unhidden, and finally, completely their own. In the months that followed, the kingdom adapted smoothly to its new queen, many quietly relieved that the harsh political maneuvering surrounding the first marriage had given way to something far more genuine. Lila brought with her a quiet understanding of the common people's struggles, having lived among them her entire life, and she worked tirelessly alongside Ashton to improve conditions for servants and laborers throughout the territory, ensuring that no other family would suffer unnecessarily under the weight of decisions made carelessly by those in power. The council, moved by the events surrounding Ashton and Lila's reunited bond, eventually enacted new protective laws regarding mate bonds throughout the territory, formally forbidding the kind of forced memory erasure that had once separated them, regardless of the political justification offered. Agatha herself helped draft these new protections, determined that the mistake she had once made under desperate circumstances would never again be repeated against anyone else within their lands. Serafina, for her part, thrived in her new role, eventually forming her own successful partnership with a neighboring territory's ambassador, a match built on mutual respect and shared ambition that suited her far better than the marriage she had originally entered for political necessity alone. She and Lila, surprisingly, developed a cautious but genuine respect for one another over time, two women who had both been shaped by circumstances beyond their control, finding common ground in the strength each had shown throughout the difficult months of upheaval they had shared. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first fallen in love, Ashton and Lila would tell the story together, of a chance meeting beside a forest fire, of memories stolen and painfully reclaimed, of a bond so powerful that even deliberate erasure could not fully destroy it. It was a story of patience rewarded, of truth eventually triumphing over fear, and of two hearts that had found their way back to each other despite every obstacle placed deliberately in their path. And every time they told it, standing together exactly as fate had always intended, the story ended the same way it always would. They had found each other, and this time, nothing would ever make them forget again.